Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second to last episode of the season here on Aligned, Engaged, Fulfilled. If you don't know yet, I'm your host, Clarence Moore. If you're new here, welcome. I'm happy you're here. On this podcast, we ask the hard questions about the problems in the world of work, and we talk about how to fix them to really build a more people centric future of work. Now, if you've been with us through the season, you know that all throughout this season, we've been building a case layer by layer, episode after episode, conversation after conversation. We've been asking what it actually takes to create the conditions for engagement, not compliance, not performance under pressure, but real sustained human engagement. And the answer every time has come back to the same foundation: alignment. Alignment between who you are and the work that you do, between your values and your environment, between the person that you bring to work and the culture that receives you. Now, earlier this season, Matt Pepsol introduced us to the concept of entropy, these invisible forces that pull alignment apart from the inside. The organizational gravity that works against connection, against trust, and against the conditions that make engagement possible. And what I've come to see as this season has unfolded is that every topic we've explored, whether it was compensation, psychological safety, culture, language, the hiring process, and purpose, each one represents one of those forces, a place where alignment either holds or fractures. Today, we're talking about one of the most powerful and most misunderstood of these forces: equity. And I want to be direct about why I'm bringing it here. As you know, Maslow's hierarchy is something that I talk a lot about. It's something that I use to build my framework on, and belonging and esteem sit in the middle of that pyramid. The social and psychological needs that have to be met before a person can reach their full potential. In the More method, I map those to engagement. And what I've come to believe, what this season has been building toward, is that equity isn't a political category, it's a structural condition. It's the question of whether the organization you're inside is actually designed to let you engage fully, or whether it's asking you to spend energy navigating barriers that have nothing to do with your work. Now, all season, we've been building the case for what engagement actually requires: leadership, compensation, safety, culture, systems, language, purpose. And today, we add the final piece. And I'd argue the one that determines whether everything else actually works for everyone in the room. And my guest today spent 28 years inside one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies, the last 10 as vice president and chief diversity and inclusion officer at Merck, building and leading their global D&I Center for Excellence. She didn't study this from the outside, she built it from the inside, at scale, inside a Fortune 100 organization for a decade. Since retiring, she founded Celeste Warren Consulting, co-founded Destination STEM, a nonprofit supporting students of color pursuing STEM degrees alongside her two children, and she published her second book, which is the one that brought her to my attention. Celeste Warren is the author of The Truth About Equity: What It Really Is, What It Isn't, and Why Everyone Wins When We Get It Right. She's a TEDx speaker whose talk makes an argument that I want to explore today: that the path to equity runs through changing systems, not just individuals. She's been recognized by Black Enterprise, Savoy Magazine, and named Chief Diversity Officer of the Year by the National Minority Supplier Development Council. Celeste, welcome to the show.
Clarence, thank you for that wonderful introduction and the invitation. Thank you.
Of course, I'm honored to have you here today, and I'm excited for this conversation. So, in In preparation for this podcast, Celeste, I watched videos of your talks and conversations with other podcasts, and there was one line you said that seemed simple, but it stopped me. You said, Equity is Leadership 101, Management 101, Marketing 101. And so I want to start there because that framing does something that I think is important. It removes equity from the category of special initiative and places it squarely inside the fundamentals of running an organization well. What did you mean by that? And what does it tell us about how equity has been misunderstood when so many organizations still treat it as something separate from the core work of leadership?
Well, thank you. And what I meant by that is from a leadership and management standpoint, what I meant by it's management 101, leadership 101. If I start with diversity, diversity is simply differences in people, those you can see and those you can't see. All of those different ideas, beliefs, cultures, life experiences, all of those differences that embody humans. Inclusion is where we surround them with this culture of inclusion, where we want to get everyone with all of those differences to be able to contribute to the organization's mission, vision, et cetera, or get them to what I call a collective purpose,
Mm,
whether they're in an organization or any other entity that they're in. So we surround them with this culture of inclusion to make sure that they feel a sense of belonging for the different ideas and beliefs and skills and capabilities that they have. Now, where equity comes in, equity understands that all of those people with all of those differences, they didn't start in the same place. They came from different cities, different parts of the world, different, as I said, different skills, capabilities. And so equity meets people where they are to put those acts of equity in place to get them to that collective purpose.
mm,
And so from a leadership and management standpoint, if I'm a manager and I have a team of 10 people, I need to be able to understand what their strengths are, what their areas for development are, what their skills and capabilities are, what their life experiences are. I need to be able to know that so I can remove any obstacles or barriers that are getting in the way from them being able to really have the best performance that they need to have as a part of my team. Because
mm,
when an individual is performing well, the team is performing well, and then you multiply that in the ripple effect, if you will, the organization is performing well.
mm,
But as a manager and a leader, I need to be able to make sure that I understand those individuals. They all came from different starting points. And what do I need to do, those acts of equity, to get them to the collective purpose of the team? That's
mm.
simply management 101 and leadership 101. Now, from a
Yeah.
business standpoint, we all know that in order, you know this especially, in order to create a marketing strategy, for example, you need to understand your customers. You need to understand what is getting in the way of your product or your services that you're providing from that customer being able to really enjoy it.
Mm,
And so you look at your customer base and you segment it. You look at the various different identities, and we know that customers around the globe very, very diverse. And so if you don't understand what's getting in the way,
mm.
then you can't really write an effective marketing, sales, commercialization strategy. And also, even on research and development, too, and understanding what needs to be developed that's going to appeal to certain customers. So
Yeah.
that's basically kind of why I say it's basically 101.
Well, I think what really appealed to me about it, and maybe I'm biased here because it maps so perfectly to my framework. Because basically, when I look at alignment, I look at three what I call core foundations, which are leadership, marketing, and strategy.
Hmm.
And I say that because not just because my background and for the last 10 years have been in leadership, marketing, and strategy, but because I have come to fully understand that those three dimensions in business and even in the context of our own careers are the most gray areas. They are so easily misunderstood and they are so subjective. Whereas if you look at finance, operations, or whatever, typically they're it's a binary process and you know very quickly if something is wrong, right? And
Hmm.
so when you said it's leadership 101, it's marketing 101, I think it spoke to the fact that the grayness of those things, but it presents it as a foundational basic principle in
Mhm.
those areas. And I think that that's really important. And when we talk about equity, there's this image that I saw, I think it was back in school, and you might be familiar with it, but and I should have brought it. But what essentially there's three people that are sitting in front of a fence,
Yeah.
and I think they're watching a game, and they're different heights, and one of them can see right over the fence, two of them can't, and so they have three different boxes
Mhm.
that put them at the same height, so they can all see the game at the same level, the same exact way. And I think that's the best representation of equity that I've
Yeah.
seen, to where it doesn't make it this complex political thing, but it really just shows it as everybody is looking at the same thing from the same place fairly across the board. Are you familiar with this
Yeah, in
graphic?
fact, I talk about that in my book.
Hmm.
I call it the rocks and fence scenario. And in my analogy, as you said, the first illustration, everybody's standing on one rock. The person on the right can't see over the fence. Person in the middle can barely see over the fence. Person on the left, they can see over the fence. Then you get to the second illustration, and those acts of equity. The person on the right has been given two additional rocks. Person in the middle, one additional rock. Now, what's happening, and I talk about this even further in the book, is in my analogy, using that same illustration, these acts of equity are causing a disruption in organizations, in society, in universities, etc. And this disruption is happening where the person that was standing on one rock in both those illustrations, they're looking to their right and they're saying, well, how come that person has three rocks, that person has two rocks, and I only have one? That's
Hmm.
not fair. That's exclusion. That's not inclusion. They have more. And the reason why they're seeing it from that vantage point is they've always been able to see over the fence. And
Hmm.
the fence, in my analogy, represents the isms. I like to call isms: racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, all of those things that happen to persons with disabilities. Like all of those isms, they didn't crop up overnight, and it's going to take longer term strategies to dismantle them from
Hmm.
institutions. And so we need to be doing the acts of equity, which is more short term, midterm strategies, putting the rocks in place. We need to also simultaneously be tearing down the fence, which is the longer term strategies. And then the third thing is we need to be having conversations with that individual who's standing on one rock in both those illustrations, because they do not understand how that fence manifests itself to his colleagues to the right. They
Hmm.
don't understand that the isms, how that looks to them, how it feels to them, how it causes, the challenges that they face, those obstacles and barriers that they face in the workplace or in society. So we need to be having a conversation with that individual and providing them with resources so they can educate themselves, and
Hmm.
also then having a dialogue and a conversation, but not just to intellectually help them to understand it, but to get them to be active allies, get them in the boat, grabbing an oar and rowing with us up the river. Because ultimately, we want to get to that third illustration, which
Yeah.
is where the rocks are gone, the fence is torn down, and
Hmm.
everyone can see the beautiful forest or the game or whatever it is that they're looking at in full view.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're trying to get to, but we're not there yet. We're in that second illustration.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your book, because you talked about, the conversations that need to be had, and I think your second book, which is called "The Truth About Equity,"
Mm,
starts that conversation, but it does so in a different way, because the subtitle at least tells me immediately that this isn't your standard DEI book, because it promises to tell people what equity isn't as much as what it is. And that's a
mhm.
harder argument to make, because it requires challenging people on both sides of the
Yeah.
conversation that has become almost entirely tribal. And critics will hear equity and they think ideology. Some
Mm,
advocates hear equity and they think compliance. Most organizations are somewhere in between, doing
yeah.
enough to say that they've done something without ever asking whether any of it is actually working. What do most well meaning leaders, including those who genuinely support the underlying values, get wrong about equity? And what would you say getting it wrong costs them and their organization?
Yeah. So I would say that there are a couple of what I call myths around it. One is when you are performing those acts of equity, that you are giving preferential treatment to one group over another. And that's not what it is intended to do. As you said in the analogy, the rocks were given to the individuals, but the rocks were given to give equal access to opportunities so they could see over the fence. The rock for the first individual wasn't taken away. Nothing was taken away from them. They could see over the fence
Mm,
before, they can see over the fence now. We just widen the gates to allow more people access to those opportunities to see over the fence. So it's not giving preferential treatment to another group where they're getting opportunities that other groups are not getting. That's not the case. It's about equal opportunity and equal access to those opportunities. The second thing is that a lot of times, and I'll use the example in talent acquisition, a hiring manager is talking to a recruiter, and the recruiter says, well, the hiring manager says, these are the skills, the characteristics, the experience, the education that I want for this particular role. And the recruiter says, okay, got it. Good. I will make sure that I bring to you a diverse set of candidates for you to interview. And then the manager might say something like, well, wait a minute, I want to make sure they're qualified candidates. And if I'm engaged in that conversation, part of that triangle conversation, I'll then say to the hiring manager and challenge him or her a bit and say, well, tell me, why did you feel a need to say that after the recruiter said they're going to bring you a diverse set of candidates? Because they're bringing you a diverse set of candidates that meet the expectations that you have for the role that you outline, the skills, the capabilities, the experience, the education, the characteristics. They're going to do their job and they're going to do it well. So tell me what you meant by that, that you don't want them to lower the standard. And of course, I get the him and the ha and the and you get them to really challenge their bias because the the myth is that if you are seeking a candidate base or diverse candidates, that you're lowering the performance standard, you're lowering the qualifications for a particular role, which underlying to that is the bias that people of color, people with disabilities, people in the LGBTQ plus community, all those people that are underrepresented in the workforce, that they are inferior or that
mm,
they don't have the level of experience or knowledge or whatever, and that they're just going to be thrown into the mix because they're diverse. And number one, that's against the law. Number
mhm.
two, that's not what it's about because all of those skills and capabilities and experiences and characteristics and capabilities, all of those things can be embodied across a vast amount and number of identities.
Yeah.
And that's what the recruiter is doing. And so the misconception and misperception here is that, well, if I go for a diverse candidate or go for this diversity, that I'm lowering the standards because they're not intelligent. They're inferior. And
Mm.
that's what we need to really make sure that people understand that that's not the case.
I love that. And I think that the really powerful thing to take away there is that one, nothing is taken away. And I think
Mm.
that's such a, to your point, a common myth, a common misunderstanding when it comes to equity. And then the equality, and that we're not lowering standards. I think those are three very important takeaways there for our listeners, is in terms of the myths around equity. So I appreciate you sharing that. Let's talk a little bit about your TEDx talk because it makes the same argument that runs through your book, that sustainable equity requires changing systems, not just individuals. And that reframe matters enormously because it changes who owns the problem and what solving it actually requires.
Yes.
A charity frame puts the burden on individuals to be more generous. And then a compliance frame puts the burden on legal and HR to check the boxes. But a systems design frame puts the burden on the people who built the organization, and it asks them to look honestly at what their design actually produces. Walk me through what that means to treat equity as a systems design problem. What are the systems that most organizations have probably never audited through that lens? And what do they find when they do?
So, Clarence, and thank you for mentioning the TED Talk. It's not out yet. It's soon to be out in a few weeks. But I talk about the cost of standing still, and the theme of the conference that I attended was around momentum. And we can't expect. A lot of times, we really focus on representation. Well, if we just get more women or more people of color or more this or more that, that everything is going to change. And that's not the case. You can't just change people in positions. You have to make sure that you are looking at the systems. You're looking at the policies, the procedures, and how those end up in manifest themselves in practices.
Mm,
You have to look at all of that. For example, all of the people policies, all of the people processes from the alpha to omega of employment, as an
mm,
example, from talent acquisition to talent development to succession planning to talent reviews to performance management, all of that needs to be looked at through a lens of who is being left behind.
mm,
And so let's just talk about talent development, for example. So, you're looking at your talent development. You have all of these programs and training programs and leadership development programs that your company offers. And one thing that a lot of the leadership training, their management um, uh, nominated. So the person has to be discussed with the management team and then
mm.
nominated to go through these leadership programs. And you're
Yep.
shaking your heads because you know what I'm talking about. And so there are a couple of things. One, when you look at the leadership skills and capabilities, are these leadership skills and capabilities transparent to everyone in the organization? Does everyone know the rules of engagement? Is every manager talking with their direct report around those leadership skills, talking to them about what they're excelling in and where they need development, and then saying, okay, I'm going to partner with you to make sure that we're able to develop you in these areas, in these skills that you need help. Is that happening across the enterprise?
Mm,
So that's one thing. And then secondly, when there's a discussion around the talent, is it a a an a discussion where the the assessment and the criteria for who even gets discussed, is it inclusive? Is it fair? Is it equitable? Is it transparent? I'm going to use that word a lot. Is it transparent? Because if people don't know how they're being evaluated, what the criteria is, how can you expect them to be able to develop themselves and excel? How can you expect them to have access to opportunities if they don't know what it is that they need to do in order to have that access? So
mm,
that's another thing. Um, the two areas. One, the leadership skills being transparent and everybody understands them. Two, every manager is having discussions with their team members so they can say, here's what you're doing well, here's where you need development, and they're partnering with them in that development journey. And then third, the criteria of the candidates being discussed, the talent being discussed in these meetings is transparent. Everybody knows what the criteria is, and you can really have a very transparent and open discussion around the talent in the organization. And once they're being elevated to decide, yes, these are the people that we want going to this leadership development program, then taking a look at it and saying, okay, does it represent how our organization looks? Because if your organization is comprised of, let's say it's 50% men, 50% women, making this up, And then in the leadership ranks, going who you're nominating to go to these leadership skills programs is 99% men. There's a little bit of bias in there.
Yeah.
And that's just from a number standpoint. So you need to be looking at all of these different things to make sure that you're not leaving any one group behind, any one person behind in these efforts.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that bias because, as you were talking, it was a word that I wrote down. And let me reframe. Talk to us about the critical role of intentionality behind equity and building equitable systems, equitable environments. Because when we talk about biases, obviously we all have them, right?
Yes.
And business leaders are often not trained. They just work through the ranks. And so they're not necessarily trained in recognizing these biases. And a lot of us operate and make decisions from an emotional place rather than a logical place. And some of the work behind building equitable environments has to come from a little bit more of a logical place than an emotional place. So talk to us about the critical role of intentionality behind equity.
Yes. So this is not something that happens through osmosis. It's not something that, oh, let me, you know, check the wind when where it blows and it's going to happen. You have to be intentional in how you approach this because these systems were built, these policies, these programs, these initiatives, these strategies, they were built in most cases looking at a distribution curve. If I think back in the day when I was getting started, looking at a distribution curve, and it's like, okay, we want to try to hit the tops of those distribution curves. And in a lot of ways, they were targeting a certain demographic. And those those demographics, number one, they've changed over the course of the last 20 years, 10 years. Um, and then secondly, you're not being inclusive when you look at it that way, when you look at your what you're creating in that way. Well, let's just make
Mm,
sure that we can hit 60% of the population, that's fine. And you're not thinking about that 60%, what that looks like, and who you're excluding when you think about that 60%.
mm,
And so that's where you have to really be intentional around understanding in a corporation, understanding the workforce, understanding what are the pain points in the employee base, understanding what the challenges are, the obstacles are in the workforce, and then building a policy system procedure, whatever, building it so you have that analysis in mind to be able to make sure you're solving the right problem
yeah.
and that problem, that intervention you're creating is going to be able to help as many people as possible, not just the people that are at the top of the distribution curve. And that
Mm,
takes intentionality. It takes looking at data. It takes understanding and studying that data. It takes, okay, understanding the pain points and then saying, what do I need to create? What are those interventions or solutions that I need to create that are going to get at those pain points in the organization?
mm. I want to zoom in a little bit on one of those problems that I think equity can solve, and really what we're exploring this season, which is the problem of engagement. So I want to connect this explicitly to what the show is built on. In Maslow's hierarchy, belonging and esteem, or the need to feel like you're part of something, the need to feel valued and respected, are prerequisites for everything above them. You can't reach self actualization, you can't reach your fullest potential if those foundational needs are unmet. In
Hmm.
my methodology, I translate that to the workplace as that engagement layer. It's the zone where people either connect to their work and their organization or they don't. Now, what equity determines is whether that middle of the pyramid is equally accessible,
Yeah.
whether every person in the organization has an equal shot at belonging, at esteem, at the conditions that make engagement possible.
Hmm.
And when it isn't, when some people have to spend extra energy navigating barriers that other people never even encounter, the cost isn't just human, it's organizational, and you're leaving engagement on the table.
Yeah.
In your experience inside organizations and even in the research, what is the actual cost of engagement when equity conditions are absent? Not the ethical cost,
Yeah.
which I think most leaders intellectually accept, but the organizational cost, the performance, the retention, the innovation that simply just never happen.
Yeah. I mean, Clarence, you almost spelled it out. It's when you don't create an environment of belonging, of inclusion, of engagement, you lose your employees. And that's why a lot of companies they have culture surveys or engagement surveys and all of that because they want to know how engaged their workforce is. Um,
But then they
and
don't engage back. Sorry, I
yes,
had to say that.
yes, yes, that's exactly true. A lot of times they get the results, they get the feedback, and they don't do anything about it, unfortunately. But in order for you to understand, a leader, a management organization, whatever, to understand and get the most out of your employees, they have to feel a sense of belonging. They have to feel that what they say, what they contribute matters.
Mm,
And not just matters in a let me nod my head, pat you on the head, and say thank you, good job, but matters in a way that they're visually seeing it. They're
mhm,
seeing it through the initiatives that are started, they're seeing it through the outcomes that are done. They're seeing it through priorities that are reached and the performance of not just the individual, the team and the organization. And they're seeing it in recognition and recognition meaning valuable feedback, not just at the end of the year at the performance review, but ongoing feedback and not necessarily just praising them for what they're doing, but
yeah,
feedback that says, well, we could have probably done this a little bit better. What do you think? What is your opinion? How do you think that we could have done this better? What are some suggestions that you have? All of that creates engagement. And also, not just about engagement, it also instills trust between the employee and the manager as well. And so you have to do all of these things because what you're going to get is discretionary effort. You're going
mm,
to get beyond the I'm here from 9 to 5, I'm doing my job, and then I'm out. You're
yeah,
going to get that discretionary effort from the standpoint of while they're there during that 9 to 5, that they're thinking beyond what they have to do on a regular basis. They're
mm,
thinking about how can I improve on what I'm doing? They're thinking about well, I just saw that this is coming down the pike. I need to make sure that I'm what one of the projects initiatives that I'm doing is linked to that. Because if
mm,
it's not, then there may be some challenges down the road. They're thinking in that way. And if you have engaged them, if you have surrounded them with a culture of empowerment, where they have this sense of belonging and they have this sense of contributing to the outcomes that are going to make the organization better.
yeah,
And all of that is just it's so important because you've heard of the a few years back it was quiet quitting and
mhm,
now some people are calling it what do you call it, job hugging. All of these
mhm,
things that when an economy is not where you want it to be and there's not a surplus of jobs where they're just staying in their roles. And you don't want them just staying there just because they can't find another job and they
right,
actually hate their
yeah,
job. You want
right,
them to be there because they want to be there because they
mm.
feel like they're contributing to the mission of the organization.
Well, let's talk. I want to zoom in a little bit more and add a layer to this topic of belonging in the workplace. And something that came up a lot over the first season of this podcast was this idea of your job is not your identity. And
Uh,
one of the things that lands hardest for me is the idea that when people can't bring their full identity to work, when they're spending energy code switching, managing perceptions, hiding parts of who they are, it doesn't just come with a personal cost. It also comes with an organizational cost because the
mhm,
person that you hired isn't the person who ends up showing up. And that gap between those two things is engagement that was never given the chance to exist.
Yeah.
And we talk on the show a lot about alignment between who you are and the environment that you're operating in. And what you're describing is a specific and structural version of misalignment,
Hmm.
one that really affects some people systematically and others not at all. What does it actually cost an organization when its people can't show up fully? And what does it take structurally, not aspirationally, to
Yeah.
build an environment where full presence is genuinely possible for everyone?
I like to say it's like whack-a-mole, where you hire someone for their skills, their capabilities, their innovation, they're a bright light, right?
Mhm.
And then they get in the organization, and every time they stick their head up, you just whack it down. And
Mm,
that
I
game
love that.
at carnivals, and that happens. That happens. Sometimes it happens really early because the recruiter paints this beautiful picture of the organization, and then they get in, and this manager who didn't understand that they're part of an organization that needs this creativity and this innovation manages them in a way where they stifle their creativity and their growth.
Yeah.
So when that creativity, that growth that is stifled, what it does is it eliminates that discretionary effort. And I'm gonna give you an example where a person is able to bring their authentic self to work. And I don't mean they're able to dress casually and all of that. What I mean is they're able to bring their cultural identity. So let's say I'm in a marketing meeting and they the team is designing a product that they think is going to be really good for the black community. And because they'd looked at the data and it said that our product isn't doing well in the black community, so with our black customers. So they're discussing things, right? And so you're sitting there, you're the only person of color in the room, right? And they're talking about we need to do this, we need to do that, or why don't we do this, or why don't we do that? And so when I talk about bringing your authentic self into the workplace, you're not just bringing your functional skills and discipline. So I'm a marketing person. So I
Mm,
understand marketing. I understand marketing strategies. I understand. I went to school for marketing. I understand marketing models. I understand all of that. But what I can also contribute is my cultural experience. And that
yeah.
cultural experience, it varies from sometimes year to year, month to month, because the cultural experience, it changes and evolves over time.
Yeah.
And so I'm able to bring my cultural experience as well as my functional skills and discipline into this discussion where I can say, okay, well, I know we want to do that, but have we thought about doing focus groups in XYZ city and maybe sort of talking with our customers who fit that identity and finding out what's getting in the way? Because according in my experience, and I'm not going to speak for all of those of African descent, but in my experience, I don't necessarily talk to an expert in XYZ. I go to my grandmother, my auntie, my uncle, and I ask them, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about that?
Mm,
So there are different things that are cultural norms that you can bring into the discussion. And so that's what I mean when I say bringing your authentic self, because you're not just coming to the workplace with your functional skills and discipline, you're
right.
also bringing your cultural experiences to the discussion. And how do you think that person feels when they're sitting there and they're able to engage in that way in a meeting at work,
Mm,
bringing the whole 360 view into
yeah.
that discussion? That you talk about engagement and feeling valued for their who they are as an individual. It blows up.
Yeah. No,
And that alignment that you talked about from an organizational standpoint, um, if the foundational values of the organization, dignity, respect, for example, if that's foundational to the organization, then those entities should be present in your business strategies, your people strategies, in the initiatives that you have, in your communications. It should be embedded in there. And if you
Yeah.
don't see that, then there's a systemic misalignment, if you were,
Yep.
because a lot of times leaders they feel like, well, I don't want to get into that conversation because I don't want to tell them that they're wrong because
Mm,
they don't believe in the same thing that I believe in. You don't have to have it a me versus they. You
right.
can align it to the cultural values of the organization and basically saying, okay, um, if you believe in the cultural values of this organization, which fundamentally are based on dignity and respect and XYZ, whatever they are, then we need to be moving forward doing it in this way. We need to make sure that our leadership skills and capabilities demonstrate that. We need to make sure that our business strategies demonstrate that and
Right.
our leadership skills. And so, if you don't believe in what the company stands for, maybe this isn't the company for you. And you
Right.
take yourself and your values and your perspectives out of it.
Well, something I want to add on the cultural experience piece is because I think it goes even beyond that on a broader scope of really bringing your nuanced perspectives into the organization. And this is something that I talk a lot about is really when if we're thinking about your unique value proposition as a person, right? It's the
Yeah.
culmination of all of the nuances that you've learned through your experiences. It's the combination of your upbringing, your trauma, your work experience, your the courses you took in college, the friends that you had. It's a culmination of all these little bits and pieces that essentially create the filter, the lens through which you see the world, through which you operate and make decisions. And when you go into an organization and you're told that the only thing that matters are things in the professional context and the experience that you have in that, it filters out so much of that nuance that you've
Yeah.
developed throughout your life that make you who you are. And you have to kind of flip this switch to turn it off. And there's a sense of incompleteness that
Yeah.
comes with you when you go into organization with that. And I think that that's important for us to really recognize is that this conversation around identity of your work self and your outside of work self is so flawed for that very reason that you can't just turn off everything you've experienced up until that point and think that you're going to work effectively as who you're supposed to be in your job.
That's
And so
exactly true, Clarence. Exactly true. I like to use the analogy of a car wash. So a person is all of those things that you talked about, right? In their community, with their family, all of those different things. And they come into the workplace, and a lot of times the company expects you to, like, you're going through a car wash, you're going through a car wash, and you're stripping off your identity, who you are, what those stressors are in your community, what you're going through, your family, all of your culture, expecting in that you to go through this car wash, which are the front doors of the organization, and you're washing all of that stuff. And then at the end of the car wash, you're walking into the organization and you're sort of this non-entity person. And
mm,
that's not reality. That's not
right.
reality at all.
Well said. Okay, I've been reading the data on where equity work stands in organizations right now, and one observation from practitioners in the field like really stopped me. And it's this idea that the notions behind why equity is imperative haven't changed, but the work has gone underground.
Mm,
And organizations are continuing to work quietly, but becoming less vocal about it, less
yeah.
communicative. And here's where my framework forces me to name what I'm actually seeing. Because from my purview, that's a misalignment gap. And we've talked about this a little bit already. When the internal identity of the organization, what it genuinely believes, what its people need, diverges from what it's willing to say publicly, you've created a communication fracture. And
Mm,
in my experience, those fractures don't stay contained. They spread, they erode trust, they send a signal, especially to the younger employees that are watching closely, about what the organization is actually willing to stand for when it costs something. And, lending to a term that Matt Pepsel brought to the conversation, this is entropy in action. The invisible force doing its work quietly, incrementally, until that gap between what an organization says it values and how it actually behaves becomes too wide to close.
Yeah.
When an organization stops speaking their values publicly while quietly continuing the work, what actually happens inside the culture? And at what point does that gap between internal reality and external silence become too wide to close?
Yeah, that's something that a lot of organizations have been struggling with, not just in the last couple of years, but for a while. And some organizations have put together what they call an engagement strategy, sort of framework that basically sort of outlines what the criteria was for when they would be speaking out, whether that be publicly, externally, internally with the organizations, how they might approach it, who is the author of the communications, because it's become so critically important for all the reasons that you talked about. That gap between what are your company's values and then what are you speaking out on behalf of? Because when I first came into corporate America or corporate global organizations, you just didn't see it. They didn't speak out on social activism. It was,
Mm,
this is what your business is, this is what you make, this is what you talk about, and that's it. And that was
yeah.
the norm. And then over the course of the decades, that has changed because of, from a generational standpoint, Generation Y, especially coming into the workforce and looking and saying, well, your ideals don't match my ideals. I don't know if it's the right company I want to come to. And it's been exasperated and um, grown even more to Generation Z, where they have choices. They don't have to go into corporations, big global corporations. They have other things that they can do with their lives, and they're making those choices. Some of them are even saying, I'm not even going to be going to college. I have, I can go into this trade or that, this, or I can
Mm,
be a influencer, or I can do
yeah.
all these different things that didn't exist before. And so, um, when a company has said, been very clear, and again, I'm gonna use that word transparent around when they speak up, why they speak up, what some of those topics might be, what are those criteria. If they're very transparent to their workforce, then the workforce understands what it is and why it is and what they're doing, what they're not doing, why they're doing it, why they're not doing it. Most corporations don't do that though. And so that's where you see that disconnect. Um, and so when you see that disconnect, where it really hits is you see people voting with their feet. They'll either leave the organization, you see a lot of turnover, or a mid to longer term challenge is the war on talent is going to become harder. It's going to be
Mm,
more of a bloodbath because of what I talked about earlier. Generation Z, they have options. They have things that they can do besides coming into corporations. So the labor pool is gotten smaller just by the sense of a few, less and less are going to college. So for those corporations that where the people need 4-year degrees, the pool is going to be smaller. um, for organizations that don't have the values and the standards that they have as a generation, the labor pool is going to get smaller. And so I
yeah.
think it's more of a challenge from a labor standpoint, the labor pool and the labor market, and then the individual employees that will actually vote through their feet and they'll leave and go to other organizations.
Yeah.
That's where it becomes, and then the people that stay because they're kind of fearful given that the economy is, they're kind of just sort of ducking their heads and doing their job. That's where it gets into that lack of engagement that we talked about
Mm,
earlier. They're not giving the discretionary effort. They're doing their job, they're going home, and that's it.
mm. I think that that last piece is one of the most important things that we can really emphasize here, because when we talk about the conversation around engagement, it's it's just focused around, oh, the people in the organization are disengaged. But I think you just offered a nuance of maybe the disengagement and the people left that are disengaged are is because those are the people who did not vote with their feet
Yeah.
and leave. And we don't talk about those people as much as we do when it comes to the people who are disengaged that are currently in the organization. So I think that's a really important and valuable nuance to look at. Now, I want to ask you something directly because I think it's a conversation that's actually happening in most organizations right now.
Mhm.
And even if it's not happening out loud, there's a leader that's listening to this who agrees with the underlying human values. They believe people should be treated fairly. They believe talent is distributed equally across every demographic, but they are gun shy about the framing. They're
Mhm.
afraid of what engaging publicly looks like from the outside. And then there's a different leader, the one who's actively skeptical, who has looked at DI programs and they've concluded, fairly or not, that they produced more resentment than results.
Mhm.
So I'd like for you to speak to both of them honestly and not diplomatically. What do you
Yeah.
say to the leader who agrees with you in private but won't say so publicly? And what do you say to the one who's genuinely skeptical, not hostile, but
Yeah.
unconvinced?
So to the leader that is believes in it but is not speaking about it, publicly. It, for me, Clarence, it's important that you do the work. All right. And like I said, you can talk about it from the standpoint of what you're doing to make sure that you're engaging all of your employees, regardless of how they identify. You can talk about how you are building trust with your employees, regardless of how they identify. And that work is what you talk about. You talk about how I have a direct report. They have a special needs child. They have to work hours that may be um, untraditional, and we need to make sure that we make it work because they're doing some great work in the time that they're available to work. And so
Mm,
I evaluate them based on not the hours, but I evaluate them based on a set of priorities and goals and objectives that we set and we revisit periodically. I evaluate them on those outcomes. I don't
mm,
evaluate them on, oh, you came during this time, you came during that time, you didn't come during this time, this but that because they have things, their life experience is different than other team members. And so these are some of the things that I'm doing.
mm.
So that's an example of you're talking about acts of equity that you're doing without even saying the word. So
Yeah.
talk about the work that you're doing so people can see it truly is good management and good leadership. And
Mm,
then to the person who's skeptical, and my conversation with them is more of a talk. It's similar but a little bit different. So asking them questions. Do you believe that each individual on your team is different? Yes, I do. Yeah, that's the only answer you could say. Yes, I do. Even if they all look alike on the outside, they're still very, very different. Do you want the most out of your team? Yes, I do. Okay, well, what are some ways that you get the best and the most out of your individual team members? What are some
mm,
things that you do? What are some practices that you do? And then when I have that conversation and I start engaging them with these are some things that you could be doing to get more out of Joe or Jane or Harry or Salvar or this person. These are some things that you can do because ultimately you're being evaluated based on how well you engage your employees and the output of your team. So I
mm,
take it away from um, you can debate with me about diversity, equity, and inclusion if you want to, but ultimately you're being evaluated based on the performance of your team and how you get there to a high level team performance is through equitable practices, inclusive cultures and environment, and making sure that you're meeting people where they are based on the differences that they bring and that are embodied in their identities.
mm. I love that. Thank you for that. I think that's really important. I know I've got you for a couple minutes, so there's a few things that I want to get through
Yep.
that I think are really important to touch on. My background is in marketing. And one of the things that I've always believed and argued is that marketing isn't a department. It happens across the entire organization. Every customer interaction, every employee behavior, every communication is a marketing moment. And
Hmm.
when we silo marketing into a function, we limit what it can actually do. And I want to ask whether the same is true for equity, because one of the things that I'm seeing in the market is that a growing number of the most thoughtful practitioners are moving toward embedding equity into core business practices,
Hmm.
hiring, performance management, leadership development, rather than positioning it as a standalone initiative. That's the anti silo argument. When we
Uh-huh.
make equity a department, a goal, a program to be managed, rather than a core value embedded in how the organization operates, do we actually feed the problem we're trying to solve?
And so what I think is, and let me put this in a way, because we get that question a lot. Let me put this in a way of quality in the manufacturing site. Quality, every manufacturer, no matter what it is that they're the industry they're in, company they're in, whatever it is they're making, every manufacturing organization says we have to make sure that we're embedding quality into every aspect from soup to nuts of our manufacturing and our supply chain process, right? But every manufacturing organization still has a quality organization. They have a quality assurance organization, they have a quality center of excellence. They have that because those are the functional experts that are helping to make sure that it's embedded throughout the manufacturing process, right? Same thing with safety, same thing with other aspects of it. So the same thing can be said for equity. You can have an organization, though those are the subject matter experts that are going to help you to build those policies, practices, procedures, systems, and those structural things that can be embedded into the organization. So
Hmm,
it's not a either or, it's a and.
love that. Thank you. All right, Celeste, you said something early in our conversation that I want to carry out of this episode, that equity is leadership 101, management 101. It's not a program you run, it's not a department that you fund, it's a condition you either build, whether
Mhm.
intentionally, structurally, courageously, or you don't. And what this season has been arguing layer by layer is that engagement is the outcome of alignment, and alignment requires the environment that you're operating in that is actually designed to receive you, all of you. That's what equity is. That's what's at stake when it's absent. If you want to connect with Celeste, learn more about her consulting work or get her book, The Truth About Equity, I'll have everything linked in the show notes. But Celeste, where else can people find you if they want to continue this conversation on equity with you?
Well, they can reach me on my website at www.crwdiversity.com. I'm on LinkedIn, Celeste Warren, she, her. I am on, I have a YouTube channel. You can engage there and check me out. I'm on Instagram where I'm a little bit more um, intimate, if you will. And then also on Substack as well and Facebook. So you can find me in all of those different social channels. But first, go to the website, with me there, get on my mailing list, and let's have a conversation and dialogue.
Awesome. To our listeners, all season we've been building the case for what engagement actually requires: leadership, compensation, safety, culture, systems, language, purpose. And today, equity, the structural condition that determines whether all of those things are equally available to everyone that you lead. For our finale next week, we'll reveal the outcomes of all of those forces because the data is in and it reframes everything we've talked about this season in a way that I think you'll feel. And lastly, if you've been feeling any sense of misalignment, but you're not sure what's causing it, what it means, or what to do about it, make sure to go take my alignment assessment. The link will be in the show notes. Celeste, thank you so much for being with us here today. It's been such an honor to have you on the mic to talk about equity and reveal what it is and what it isn't. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for the invitation, Clarence. It was a great conversation.
Truly my pleasure. All right, everyone. I'm Clarence Moore. This is Aligned, Engaged, Fulfilled, and I'll see you next week for our final episode.